Thank you. Well, it's so exciting to be here. And yes, as you can tell, I'm from the deep south of England. And as Kim said, I could probably read you the phone book, and not only would you love it, but you'd think I was a genius. So I'm off to a good start before we've even begun. But I'm just so grateful for being invited here. But I want to take you back to early 2004. We were still living in England, and I'd been home less than 24 hours when I got the call from my sister Claire. It was time. I'd hardly been back in the country less than 24 hours, not enough time to throw my undies in the wash or put my suitcase back in the attic, and she called me to say it was time. I'd been visiting my mum in Vancouver, Canada. She moved there about 20 years before when she married my wonderful stepfather, but she'd been battling small cell aggressive lung cancer. And I just got back from visiting her. We'd had 2 wonderful weeks, and yes, she was sick, and yes, we knew she didn't have long, but it was time? Had things deteriorated that quickly? Could it really be time? So I chucked some mismatched clothes in a suitcase, planted a kiss on my husband and our 3 kids, shot off to the airport and boarded a flight back to Vancouver. And as I arrived at the hospital, I was the last of her 3 daughters to arrive there. And I went in and I perched on the edge of her bed, and it was as if she breathed a sigh of relief, and she smiled with the corners of her mouth, and she said, "You're here. You made it." And as her breathing became labored and she slipped into unconsciousness, we held her hands, we prayed, we told her we loved her, and we told her she could let go. And she died as we looked on helplessly. Then, 6 short years later, I got the call again from Claire. This time, it was time again. This time, I had been visiting my other sister, Jo, in England. By this time, I'd moved to Charlotte to Plant City Church with my husband and my family. And I had been back in England visiting my sister, Jo, who was also battling small cell aggressive lung cancer. So, like I did before, I hopped back on a plane, went across the Atlantic, this time in the other direction. I raced to the hospital, sat on the side of her bed, and I saw the relief fill her eyes, the corners of her mouth turn up in a smile just like her mum's. And she said, "You're here, you made it." And like her mum, she started to, her breathing became labored, she slipped into unconsciousness. We prayed, we held her paper soft hands, told her we loved her, told her she could let go, and she passed away as we looked on helplessly, and she was just 43 years old. 6 weeks later, I was told that I had cancer. But mine wasn't lung cancer. Mine was rectal cancer. If you're going to get cancer, you don't want to get rectal cancer. It's not pretty, it's not sexy, and it doesn't come with a pretty pink bow, I can assure you. I used to say that when you're diagnosed with rectal cancer, the bottom falls out of your world, and then, yes, the world falls out of your bottom. So I was diagnosed with cancer, and 6 weeks after my sister had died, 6 years after my mum had died, and I was like, what? Are you kidding me? Had the heat-seeking missile of death now locked in on me? Was it my turn? Would my kids be rushing to my bedside and holding my hand and loving me and telling me I could go as my breathing became labored and I slipped into unconsciousness? Was it my time? Would I pass away at just 43? And tonight we're talking about struggling with renewal and what that looks like. And one of the things I've struggled with, and I'm sure many of you do too, is that as we're trying to be good little Christians and, pursue God, that stuff keeps happening. Hard stuff, tough stuff, painful stuff. And there I was, trying to be renewed by the transforming of my mind, be transformed by the renewing of my mind. And I was trying to live by the Spirit, not by the flesh. And I was trying to be a new creation in Christ, but it was like I kept getting swiped off the path to renewal. And so over the course of all this happening, I've started thinking, well, is there something else going on? Have I got it wrong? And so, I want to suggest that there's something going on. And since going through my cancer journey, and I went through chemo and radiation, I had surgery where I got one of those nice ostomy bags, so I could walk, talk, and poop all at the same time. It was amazing. It's quite a nightmare as well, because they have a tendency of kind of bursting and leaking, which is not good in Target. So, I've reflected on my journey, and I've also reflected on the disciples. Because when we think about the disciples, they didn't have a happy, skippy life either. They didn't have a problem-free life, even after they decided to follow Jesus. And so I'm thinking, what's going on? And the classic story for me of the disciples is when they're in the boat and they've gone fishing and they're out on the lake with Jesus, who's fallen asleep in the front of the boat, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, this storm comes up and threatens to sweep over the boat. In Matthew 8:24, it says, without warning, and the storm was so furious, the waves swept over the boat. I mean, these chaps were experienced, weathered fishermen. They were used to the kind of ever-changing, suddenly changing weather patterns out on the lake. They knew how to handle a boat. It must have been really bad for them to be terrified and frightened for their lives. And when I think about that, suddenly this storm came out of nowhere and sideswiped them, if you like. And I think, well, that's what happened to me. That's what happened with me and my cancer. It threatened to drown me. It came out of nowhere. I was fit, I was healthy. I'd just run a marathon, for goodness sake. So I was completely sideswiped by it. And so when I think about me and my journey, and I look at the disciples and what they did, I see these parallels. I see something that they did right that I didn't do, something that they did wrong that I did do, and something that they knew that I am still trying to wrap my head around and learn. The first thing that they did right is that they went straight to Jesus. Matthew 8:24 says, suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And I'd like to say that my first reaction whenever a storm of life comes and sideswipes me, that I go straight to Jesus. But I don't. If I'm honest, I go to a friend, I go to Ben & Jerry's, I go to Google. There are many places that I go. And if I'm honest, he probably gets third or fourth dibs, probably last resort. Because I'm a coper. And I like to stay in control. I think that if the Bible was written with me as the disciples, it would read something like this. Suddenly, a furious storm came up on the lake, so the waves swept over the boat. Niki was terrified. She pulled in the mainsail, she started to bail out, she held onto the rudder as best she could, and she checked for the safety manual. She even checked the weather app on her phone to see if the storm was going to stop. But then she lost her phone overboard. Finally, she noticed Jesus was asleep in the front of the boat. She tentatively went up to see him and said, excuse me, Jesus, I hate to disturb you, and I know you're really, really busy. I've done all I can. I've pulled in the mainsail. I've bailed out. I've sent up a flare. Would you mind awfully helping? So our natural instinct is to cope, isn't it? It's to battle on or bitch about it and to figure it out. They say, take it to the throne, don't take it to the phone, but and I'm a Brit. I can keep calm and carry on with the best of them. And my stiff and perfectly bleached upper lip will just, hold it all together. But the disciples, they did something right. Right from the beginning, they went straight to him. And I think they didn't just let him into the physical storm that was going on. They were letting him into the personal storm. That fear that was going on inside them. And when we don't go to him, it's like we're putting up that barrier. My stiff upper lip says, thanks, Jesus, I got this. And so I think when we don't let him in, he can't comfort us, he can't strengthen us, he can't give us the peace, and he certainly can't renew us. I was diagnosed after a colonoscopy, which is a joy unto itself, I have to say. And I was still drugged, and on that Michael Jackson juice that they give you. And the doctor just said, well, I'm really sorry, but we found a tumor about the size of a fun-sized Kit Kat up where the sun doesn't shine. He didn't say it quite like that. He was a bit nicer than that. And I was like, oh, okay. And I think it was partly the drugs, but it was partly, Hardy by name, Hardy by nature. I just keep it together. And then a few days later, when I got the call from my doctor that the biopsy had come back and it was definitely cancer, I lost it. I absolutely lost it. I remember I was in the car and I just sobbed and I had to pull over and there's snot and tears everywhere and I just had nothing left. Suddenly, the barrier came down. And it was then that I was able to cry out and just say, help, Jesus. And then he was able to come in and he was able to work. I wish he'd worked in the physical storm and rebuked my cancer and it was gone, but he didn't. But my emotional storm was calmed a bit and I had a peace that wasn't there before. And I've discovered that Jesus isn't going to barge in and take over. He waits to be asked. He stands at the door of the heart and knocks, and we need to let him in. And he likes to work from the inside out. And so then he can start renewing us and comforting us and giving us peace. So the disciples got it right when they went straight to Jesus first, but they got it wrong when they chose fear over faith. And they went to him in fear. It says here in verse 25 and 26, when they said, we're going to drown. And he replied, oh, you of little faith, why are you so afraid? And there's part of me who wants to go, duh, why are they afraid? They're going to drown. I'm right there with them. And I think fear is a reflex reaction. When something dramatic and something painful and something frightening happens, it's this reflex reaction and it's powerful and it's got momentum and it's tangible and we can do something with it. And it's pregnant with all those answers to questions we don't know the answer to, the how, the why, all those kind of things. And it has momentum. And our fear is fanned by our past experiences, isn't it? My fear was fanned by my mum and Joe's death. And I'm not saying that when we're diagnosed with something or your kid gets hit by a drunk driver or you lose your job or something happens, you can't be frightened. But I think what Jesus wants us to do is turn that fear into faith-filled action. Rather than coming to him in fear, can we come to him in faith, knowing he loves us and he wants to comfort us and we are good enough just the way we are. And I think that I kind of have this default setting that's set to fear. Something happens, click, it goes over to fear. And I found during my cancer that the only way that I could click that switch back again to become faith-filled action and not action built out of fear was when I recited a scripture verse. And my favorite verse was from a verse in Psalm 62 that said, my soul finds rest in God alone. My salvation comes from him. He alone is my rock and salvation. He is my fortress. I will never be shaken. And I could never say that all in one go. And it became a mantra. You are my rock and my salvation, my fortress and my strength. I'd be waiting for scan results. You're my rock and my salvation, my fortress and my strength. I'd be, sitting there getting chemo. You are my rock and my salvation, my fortress and my strength. That is the only way I knew to turn my fear into faith. And then, that's when we can start to feel God working in us. When we go to him first and when we manage somehow to switch that switch to faith-filled action, then he can start to work in us and do something in us and transform us. And the last thing the disciples did is that they knew this truth, that his power and purposes are better than ours. They're so much better than ours. They knew because they'd just seen Jesus heal the centurion servant and the paralytic. They knew he had good stuff. And I don't know about you, but even if I manage to go to Jesus first and I go in faith-filled action, then I want to tell him how he's got to save me. So, Lord, save me. Could you do this? Then you've got to do this, and then you've got to do this. Thank you. That's how I work. It's so easy. That's what we want to say to him. And when your storm's rectal cancer, you'd think you'd have no plan. But oh my goodness, I had all sorts of ideas for how Jesus was going to fix this. One night we had an amazing prayer time where people from church, we pastor a church, there was a lot of people who wanted to pray for me, which was absolutely wonderful. And we had this evening of prayer where people anointed me with oil and God showed up in such power, and there were words and pictures about my complete healing and how I'd preached the word of the Lord. And I was like, yes, I am going to be miraculously healed, and then I'm going to preach about the miracles of God. Thank you, Lord. I've got this. A few days later, I'm having a scope. Don't ask about the details. I was having a scope, and the doctor says, oh yes, there's your tumor, and oh, I'm afraid it's in a few lymph nodes as well. And I was like, excuse me? Jesus, we had a plan. I had said it all out for him. Now, 5-6 years on, having been through all the treatments and stuff, his plans are so much better. Yes, I'm healed. Yes, I'm preaching the word of the Lord. But it's not the way I said. And he has done a mighty work in me since then that wouldn't have happened had he have just snapped his fingers and it all been cleared up. His plans and purposes are better for us. And his plans and purposes are always for renewal and transformation. As Kim said, he loves us enough not to leave us the way we are. So, there I was, a good little Christian, trying to be renewed, trying my darndest, and stuff kept happening. The death of my mum, the death of my sister, my own diagnosis, and it would sideswipe me off the path to renewal that I had so determinedly set myself on. But since then, I've come to realize that that's the wrong way to view it, that there's more going on. That the storms of life don't sideswipe us off the path to renewal, but are the way to the renewal. And it's through the storms, and it's through this tough stuff that we come to learn that Jesus, and when we come to Jesus first, and we're able to flick that switch and come in faith-filled action, and we trust that his plans and his purposes for us are better than we could ever have. And it's in doing that that we're renewed. So, if you're in a storm right now, if life is just beating you up and you feel like you're being swept over by mighty waves and you're going to drown and you can't catch your breath, I really want to encourage you that renewal isn't something to put back on your action list once you've got this sorted out. Once this storm is over, you can start back on that nice little renewal journey with God, that it's an added extra. I want to encourage you that it's through the storm that this renewal and this transformation, like Emily was saying, comes out of it. It's not pretty and it's often painful, but it is so much better. It comes out of it. In fact, I would say it's one of the gifts that come out of the storms of life. So I'm not there yet. I'm still learning, and I'm learning that even if we don't have a troubled-free life, the Bible promises us that he's going to meet us in the storms of life and renew us through them. Thank you.